Steve Harvey had seen just about everything during his years hosting Family Feud. But on a warm September afternoon in 2024, he was about to experience a moment that would leave him completely speechless and struggling to maintain his composure. The studio was filled with the usual energy and excitement as two families prepared to compete. But one contestant was about to deliver a revelation so profound, so heartbreaking and beautiful, that it would stop Steve Harvey dead in his tracks and leave everyone in the studio fighting back tears. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because stories like this one remind us all what truly matters in life, and you won't want to miss a single moment of what happens next. The Williams family from Ohio stood on one side of the stage, their energy palpable and their matching royal blue shirts displaying their family name proudly. On the other side stood the Rodriguez family from Texas, equally enthusiastic and ready to compete. But it was one member of the Rodriguez family who immediately caught everyone's attention, not just because of his age, but because of the quiet dignity and presence he carried with him. Robert Rodriguez was 97 years old, and he stood at the podium with the kind of straight-backed posture that spoke of a lifetime of discipline and pride. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he wore a pressed white shirt under a burgundy sweater vest that his granddaughter had helped him pick out specifically for this appearance. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work, rested gently on the podium, and his eyes, though lined with age, sparkled with a sharpness that suggested his mind was as clear as it had been 70 years ago. Robert had been born in 1927 in a small town outside San Antonio, Texas. He had grown up during the Great Depression, watching his parents struggle to put food on the table while maintaining their dignity and their faith. He learned early that hard work and perseverance were not just virtues but necessities for survival. At 17, he had lied about his age to enlist in the Navy during World War II, serving his country with honor in the Pacific Theater. When he returned home, he used the GI Bill to attend trade school, becoming a master carpenter whose craftsmanship was sought after throughout his community. But the true story of Robert's life was not about his career accomplishments or his military service, as impressive as those were. The real story was about Margaret, the woman he had married in 1949 and loved faithfully for 73 years, until her passing just 6 months before this Family Feud taping. Margaret had been the light of Robert's life from the moment he first saw her at a church social in 1948. She was volunteering at a food drive, her dark hair pulled back in the style of the day, her smile warm and genuine as she served meals to families in need. Robert had been immediately smitten, and he spent weeks working up the courage to ask her to have coffee with him. Their courtship had been proper and sweet, filled with long walks, conversations about their dreams, and a growing certainty that they had found in each other something rare and precious. They married a year later in a simple ceremony at the same church where they met, beginning a partnership that would span nearly 3/4 of a century. Together they raised 4 children on Robert's carpenter wages and Margaret's income from teaching piano lessons in their living room. They weathered financial hardships, celebrated triumphs, supported each other through losses, and built a family legacy that now included 11 grandchildren and 19 great-grandchildren. Their marriage had been the kind that others aspired to, marked not by grand romantic gestures, but by daily acts of kindness, unwavering loyalty, and a deep friendship that only grew stronger with time. Margaret had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months before the Family Feud taping. The diagnosis had come suddenly, a devastating blow after a lifetime of good health and vitality. Robert, despite his advanced age, had become her primary caregiver, refusing to let anyone else take on what he considered his sacred responsibility. He had helped her dress, prepared her meals exactly as she liked them, read to her for hours when she was too weak to hold a book herself, and held her hand through every doctor's appointment and treatment. When the treatment stopped working and Margaret entered hospice care, Robert moved a cot into her room and slept beside her every night, wanting to be there for every moment they had left together. In those final weeks, Margaret had made several requests of Robert, some practical and some more personal. She wanted to make sure he would accept help from their children after she was gone. She wanted him to keep attending the weekly domino games with his friends at the senior center because she knew how much he enjoyed the social connection. She wanted him to continue volunteering at the church food bank because giving back had always been important to both of them. But there was one final request that Margaret made just 3 days before she passed away. A request so unusual and yet so perfectly in character that it had brought tears to the eyes of every family member who heard about it. Margaret had gathered enough strength to sit up in bed, and she had looked at Robert with the same clear-eyed determination she had shown throughout their marriage. She told him that she knew how much he loved watching Family Feud together every evening, how it had been their ritual for years to sit side by side on their worn sofa, holding hands and calling out answers to Steve Harvey's questions, laughing at the funny responses and celebrating when their answers matched the survey results. She told him that she wanted him to promise that he would try out for Family Feud, that he would get their family together and apply to be contestants, and that when he got on that stage, he would play the game with the same joy and enthusiasm they had shared during all those evenings together. She told him that she didn't want their children and grandchildren to remember only her illness and death, but to have a new, happy memory of their grandfather doing something fun and unexpected, something that would make them smile whenever they thought about it. And most importantly, she told him that she would be watching from heaven, cheering him on, and that he should play the game not with sadness but with celebration, honoring their life together by embracing joy rather than dwelling in grief. Robert had promised her, his voice thick with emotion, that he would do exactly as she asked. He had held her hand and told her that he would get on Family Feud, and he would play the best game of his life because that's what she deserved. A husband who kept his promises even after she was gone. 3 days later, Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Robert holding her hand just as he had held it for 73 years of marriage. In the months that followed, Robert's family had tried to help him through his grief, but they worried constantly about him. He seemed to be going through the motions of living without really being present. He attended church, he went to his domino games, he volunteered at the food bank, but the spark that had always animated him seemed to have dimmed considerably. Then one day, his oldest granddaughter, Elena, had remembered Margaret's final request. She had gathered the family together and announced that they were going to apply for Family Feud, not just because Grandmother Margaret had asked them to, but because they needed to help Grandfather Robert find his way back to joy. The application process had taken months, but the Rodriguez family's story had resonated with the show's producers. When they received the call that they had been selected to compete, Robert had broken down in tears, the first time his family had seen him cry since Margaret's funeral. He said he could feel Margaret's presence in that moment, could almost hear her laughing with delight at the news. The family had made the trip to the studio together, turning it into a multi-generational adventure that included not just the 5 family members who would compete, but also several others who came along for support. Elena had helped Robert pick out his outfit, making sure he looked his very best for his television debut. His son Michael had practiced Family Feud questions with him every evening for 2 weeks, helping him feel prepared and confident. His youngest granddaughter had made him a special bracelet with Margaret's initials on it, which he wore on his wrist as a reminder that she was with him in spirit. Now, standing on the Family Feud stage with studio lights bright overhead and cameras pointed in his direction, Robert felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. There was excitement, certainly, the thrill of doing something so completely outside his normal routine. There was nervousness because despite all his years and all his experiences, being on television in front of millions of people was daunting. But most of all, there was a bittersweet longing for Margaret, a wish that she could be standing beside him physically rather than just in his heart and memory. Steve Harvey began the introduction of the families, his signature energy and humor filling the studio. When he reached Robert, Steve paused, taking in the distinguished elderly gentleman with obvious respect and curiosity. Steve asked Robert his age, and when Robert answered that he was 97 years old, the audience erupted in applause. Steve's eyebrows shot up in genuine amazement, and he asked Robert what his secret to longevity was. Robert had smiled, a sad but warm smile, and replied that the secret had been loving a good woman for 73 years, though he had lost her just 6 months ago. The mood in the studio shifted slightly, becoming more tender and respectful. Steve expressed his condolences with genuine warmth, telling Robert that 73 years of marriage was an incredible achievement and a testament to real love. Then Steve moved on with the game, asking the first question and watching as both families competed with enthusiasm and good humor. The Rodriguez family was doing well, matching answers and building points, and Robert himself had contributed 2 solid answers that had earned high scores. His family members kept glancing at him with pride and encouragement, clearly thrilled to be sharing this experience with their beloved patriarch. The Williams family was equally strong, keeping the competition close and exciting. The energy in the studio was positive and entertaining, exactly what Family Feud audiences expected and loved. Then came the lightning round, fast money, and the Rodriguez family had accumulated just enough points to win the main game by a narrow margin. The family would now compete for the grand prize, with 2 family members answering 5 questions each, trying to reach 200 points combined. Elena, Robert's granddaughter, volunteered to go first. She approached the podium with visible nerves but handled the questions well, giving solid answers that earned a respectable total of 143 points. That meant the second Rodriguez family member needed to score only 57 points to win the $20,000 grand prize. The family huddled together to decide who should take the second position, and that's when something unexpected happened. Robert stepped forward with a determination that surprised everyone, including Steve Harvey. His family members looked uncertain, worried that the pressure might be too much for their 97-year-old grandfather, but Robert insisted with a quiet firmness that this was something he needed to do. Steve Harvey looked at Robert with a mixture of admiration and concern. He asked Robert if he was sure he wanted to take on fast money at 97 years old, gently reminding him that it required answering 5 questions in just 20 seconds with no time to think or hesitate. Robert looked directly at Steve, and something in the old man's eyes made Steve pause. There was a steely resolve there, a sense of purpose that transcended a simple game show. Robert told Steve that he had made a promise to someone very important, and he intended to keep it. Steve nodded slowly, recognizing that there was something deeper happening here than just a game. He told Robert that he respected that, and he would give him his best shot at those questions. The audience fell silent as Robert positioned himself at the podium. His hands, those weathered carpenter's hands that had built homes and cradles and furniture for 3 generations of his family, rested steady on the surface in front of him. Steve announced that 20 seconds would go on the clock, and asked Robert if he was ready. Robert nodded once, touching the bracelet on his wrist briefly, as if drawing strength from Margaret's memory. The questions came rapidly. Steve asked Robert to name something people are afraid of. Spiders, Robert answered without hesitation. Steve continued, asking Robert to name a food that starts with the letter P. Pizza, came the immediate response. Steve asked what time most people wake up on a weekday. 6 a.m., Robert said clearly. Steve asked Robert to name something you might find in a bathroom. Towels, Robert answered. Finally, Steve asked Robert to name a reason someone might be late to work. Traffic, Robert responded just as the buzzer sounded. The audience applauded enthusiastically, impressed by how quickly and confidently the 97-year-old man had handled the pressure. Robert stepped back from the podium, and his family embraced him with obvious pride and relief. Now came the moment of truth, the reveal of whether Robert's answers had scored enough points to reach the 200-point threshold. Steve began the process of unveiling the results, building tension with his characteristic showmanship. Robert's answer of spiders for something people are afraid of was revealed as the number 3 answer, earning 22 points. The audience cheered. Pizza for a food that starts with P was the number 1 answer, earning 41 points. The family was getting excited now, realizing they were getting close to the target. 6 a.m. for the time most people wake up on a weekday showed as the number 2 answer, adding 33 more points. The Rodriguez family was now at 96 points from Robert's round alone, meaning they had passed the 200-point threshold and won the $20,000. The studio erupted in celebration, family members hugging Robert and jumping up and down with joy. But Steve Harvey held up his hand, indicating there were still 2 more answers to reveal. The audience settled down, curious to see how well Robert had done overall. Towels for something you might find in a bathroom was shown as the number 1 answer, adding 37 points. Traffic as a reason someone might be late to work came up as the #1 answer as well, contributing 44 points. Robert had not only won the game for his family, he had achieved something remarkable, getting 4 out of 5 answers as either the #1 or #2 survey response, scoring an impressive 177 points in his fast money round alone. Steve Harvey stood looking at Robert with undisguised amazement and respect. The audience gave Robert a standing ovation that lasted for nearly a minute. Steve approached Robert, shaking his hand firmly and telling him that what he had just accomplished at 97 years old was one of the most impressive performances he had ever witnessed in all his years of hosting. Robert smiled, but there were tears forming in his eyes. Steve noticed, and his expression shifted from celebration to concern. He asked Robert if he was okay, if the excitement had been too much. Robert shook his head and told Steve that he was fine. Better than fine, actually. He said he just wished Margaret could have been there to see it. Steve's face softened with compassion, and he put a comforting hand on Robert's shoulder. He told Robert that he had no doubt Margaret had seen every second of it and was incredibly proud. Then Steve said something that would open the door to the moment that would change everything. He asked Robert to tell him a little bit about Margaret, about what had made their marriage so special and lasting. Robert took a deep breath, steadying himself. He began to speak about Margaret in a voice that carried across the silent studio. He told Steve and the audience that Margaret had been the kindest person he had ever known, that she had taught piano to children in their neighborhood for 40 years, often giving free lessons to families who couldn't afford to pay. He said she had volunteered at church, organized food drives, visited lonely elderly people in nursing homes, and baked cookies for every new neighbor who moved onto their street. He said she had raised their 4 children with patience and wisdom, had been a grandmother who actually listened to what the grandchildren were saying rather than just waiting for her turn to talk, and had been a great-grandmother who could still get down on the floor to play blocks with toddlers even in her 80s. He said she had been his best friend, his partner in every decision, his comfort in hard times, and his celebration in good times. He said that in 73 years of marriage, he had never once regretted his choice or wished for a different life, because life with Margaret had been everything he could have wanted. The audience was quiet, many people dabbing at their eyes. Steve Harvey himself was visibly moved, his usual quick wit replaced by genuine emotion. Then Steve asked Robert a question that would lead to the revelation that would stop his breathing and leave the entire studio in stunned silence. He asked Robert how he was managing now, 6 months after Margaret's passing, and whether there was anything that helped him through the grief. Robert looked at Steve, and something shifted in his expression. He touched the bracelet on his wrist again, and then he began to speak about Margaret's final request. He told Steve and the audience about how he and Margaret had watched Family Feud together every single evening for years, how it had been their special time together, their ritual that they looked forward to each day. He explained how Margaret, even while dying, had been thinking about him and about their family, wanting to give them all one more happy memory rather than leaving them only with the sadness of her illness. Robert's voice grew stronger as he explained Margaret's request that he apply for Family Feud, that he get on the show and play the game with joy rather than grief, that he create a new memory for their family that would make them smile whenever they thought about it. He told Steve that Margaret had made him promise that when he got on the show, he would play not like a man in mourning, but like a man celebrating 73 years of love and partnership. He said that every answer he had given in Fast Money had been one that he and Margaret had shouted out together during their evening viewing sessions, that playing the game had felt like she was right there beside him, that for those brief moments at the podium, he had felt connected to her again in a way that had been missing for 6 months. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Steve Harvey's eyes were glistening with unshed tears, and his usual composure was visibly shaken. But then, Robert said something that made Steve actually stop breathing for a moment, that caused the host to stand completely frozen as the weight of the revelation settled over him. Robert explained that Margaret's final request had not been just about getting on Family Feud and playing the game. There had been more to it, a specific instruction that Margaret had given him about what to do if he won. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn from being carried close to his heart for 6 months. He unfolded it carefully, handling it with the reverence one might show a sacred text. He explained that Margaret had written this letter 3 days before she died, that she had asked the hospice nurse to help her sit up so she could write it clearly, because it was important to her that Robert have something physical to hold on to, something in her own handwriting that he could keep and read whenever he needed to feel close to her. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter, and his voice cracked with emotion as he began to read Margaret's words aloud. Margaret had written that if Robert and their family were blessed enough to win on Family Feud, she wanted the money to go towards something specific, something that would honor their life together while also helping others. Margaret had written that she wanted the $20,000 to be donated to their church's food bank, the same food bank where Robert had volunteered for decades and where they had both spent countless hours serving their community. But Margaret's request was even more specific than that. She wanted the money to be used to create a program that would provide free meals to elderly people who had lost their spouses and were struggling with both grief and the practical challenges of cooking for one after a lifetime of cooking for two. She wanted it to be a program that didn't just deliver food but also delivered companionship, with volunteers sitting and eating with the bereaved, listening to their stories, looking at their photos, and helping them feel less alone in their grief. Margaret had written that she knew firsthand how devastating it was to face a terminal illness, but she also knew that the person left behind often faced an equally devastating challenge, that of learning to live alone after decades of partnership, that of finding purpose and meaning when the center of your world had disappeared. Margaret had written that she couldn't bear the thought of Robert going through that alone, and while she knew their family would care for him, she also knew he would meet other widowers and widows at church and in the community who didn't have large families or strong support systems. She had written that if they won money on Family Feud, she wanted it used to help those people, to give them both nourishment for their bodies and comfort for their souls. She had written that this would be her final act of service, her last chance to help others, and that it would give her peace knowing that even after she was gone, she and Robert together were still making a difference in their community. Robert finished reading the letter and looked up at Steve Harvey. He said that he was standing there on that stage, having just won $20,000, and he was about to give every penny of it away, because that's what Margaret had asked him to do, and because he knew in his heart it was exactly the right thing to do. He said that Margaret had always been the generous one, always thinking of others before herself, and that honoring her final request was the last gift he could give her, the last way he could show her that their love and their partnership continued, even beyond death. Steve Harvey stood completely motionless, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound emotion. For several long seconds, he didn't speak, didn't move, appeared to have forgotten how to breathe. The entire studio was silent except for the soft sounds of people crying. When Steve finally found his voice, it came out rough and unsteady. He told Robert that in all his years in entertainment, in all his years of hosting Family Feud and meeting thousands of contestants, he had never heard anything like this, had never witnessed a love so deep and pure that it extended beyond the grave in such a beautiful and selfless way. Steve said that Margaret must have been an extraordinary woman to think of others even in her final days, and that Robert was an extraordinary man to honor her wishes without hesitation. Steve turned to address the cameras directly, his voice thick with emotion, as he told the audience watching at home that what they had just witnessed was not just entertainment or a game show, but a profound lesson in love, commitment, service, and the legacy that truly matters. Then Steve did something unprecedented in Family Feud history. He announced that he would personally match the $20,000 prize, doubling the donation to $40,000, so that Margaret's vision of a meal and companionship program for grieving widows and widowers could have an even greater impact. The audience erupted in applause and cheers, many people standing and crying at the same time. Robert looked at Steve with such gratitude and emotion that he seemed unable to speak. Steve embraced Robert, the two men holding each other in a moment of pure human connection that transcended television, game shows, and entertainment. Steve told Robert that Margaret was surely looking down at that moment, her heart full of pride and love, knowing that the man she had chosen to spend 73 years with was still the same good man she had fallen in love with all those decades ago. Robert finally managed to speak, thanking Steve not just for the money but for allowing him to honor Margaret's memory in such a public way, for giving him the opportunity to tell the world about the remarkable woman she had been and the beautiful life they had shared together. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip went viral within hours, viewed by millions of people around the world. Comments poured in from people of all ages and backgrounds, all of them moved by Robert's devotion, Margaret's selflessness, and the beautiful example of lasting love that their story represented. But more than just emotional responses, the episode sparked action. Churches and community organizations around the country began reaching out to the Rodriguez family church, asking for information about how to create similar programs in their own communities. Donations flooded in from viewers who wanted to support Margaret's vision, with the original $40,000 growing to over $300,000 within 3 months. The program that Margaret had envisioned expanded far beyond what anyone had imagined, eventually serving not just Robert's church but creating a network of meal and companionship programs in 17 states. Robert himself became an unexpected advocate for elderly grief support, speaking at churches and community centers about the challenges of losing a spouse after a long marriage. He always carried Margaret's letter with him, the paper now protected in a clear sleeve to preserve it, and he would read her words to audiences who invariably ended up in tears. He told people that grief was not something to be ashamed of or to hurry through, that it was the price of having loved deeply, but that Margaret had taught him that even in grief, there was still purpose and meaning to be found in service to others. He said that the Meals program had not only helped dozens of other widows and widowers, it had helped him too, giving him a mission and a connection to Margaret that eased his loneliness and gave structure to his days. He volunteered weekly with the program, often being the one to sit and share meals with newly bereaved spouses, listening to their stories of love and loss, looking at photos of their late partners, and assuring them that while the pain never completely disappeared, it did eventually transform into something more bearable, a tender remembrance rather than a sharp agony. Steve Harvey stayed connected with Robert, checking in on him regularly and featuring updates about the Meals program on his talk show. A year after the original Family Feud appearance, Steve invited Robert back for a special reunion episode. The segment showed the incredible growth of Margaret's legacy program, featured testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by it, and included a moving moment where Robert visited Margaret's grave to tell her about everything that had happened since that Family Feud taping. Steve accompanied Robert to the cemetery, and the cameras captured Robert kneeling beside Margaret's headstone, touching the engraved letters of her name as he spoke to her as naturally as if she were still alive. He told her that he had kept his promise, that he had gotten on Family Feud and played the game with joy rather than sadness, that he had honored her final request, and it had grown into something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. He told her that he missed her every single day, but that he was finding his way, that their family was doing well, and that her memory was living on not just in their hearts, but in the lives of all the people being served by the program that bore her name. The segment ended with Steve and Robert sitting together on a bench near Margaret's grave, talking about love and loss and legacy. Steve asked Robert what he wanted people to remember most about Margaret and their marriage. Robert thought for a long moment before answering that he wanted people to understand that real love was not about grand gestures or perfect romance, but about showing up every day, about choosing your partner again and again through decades of ordinary moments, about building a life together that was based on respect and kindness and genuine friendship. He said that he and Margaret had certainly had their disagreements over 73 years, had faced struggles and hard times, but they had always come back to their commitment to each other and to the values they shared. He said that Margaret's final request was perfectly in character because she had spent her entire life thinking about how to help others and make the world a little bit better. And she had approached her death the same way, turning even that final passage into an opportunity to serve and give. 2 years after the Family Feud appearance, the Margaret Rodriguez Memorial Meal and Companionship Program was serving over 2,000 bereaved spouses across the country. The program had evolved to include not just meals but also grief counseling, social activities, and support groups specifically designed for people who had lost partners after long marriages. Research showed that elderly people who lost spouses face significantly higher risks of depression, physical decline, and even early death, But the participants in Margaret's program showed dramatically better outcomes, maintaining their health, forming new friendships, and finding renewed purpose in their later years. Robert continued to volunteer, now at 99 years old, still sharp and engaged, still carrying Margaret's letter, still telling anyone who would listen about the remarkable woman he had loved for 73 years. The story of Robert and Margaret Rodriguez became a touchstone for discussions about love, aging, grief, and legacy. Marriage counselors used their story as an example of commitment and partnership. Hospice workers shared it with dying patients and their families to illustrate how final wishes could create meaning and purpose even in the face of death. Churches and community organizations studied their meal program as a model for practical, compassionate service. And countless ordinary people who watched that Family Feud episode found themselves inspired to think differently about their own relationships, about the legacies they were building, and about the difference that simple acts of kindness and generosity could make in the world. The moment when Steve Harvey stopped breathing, when he stood frozen in the face of such profound love and selflessness, became one of the most replayed and shared clips in game show history, a reminder that sometimes real life provides moments more moving and meaningful than any scripted television could ever create. Before we close this incredible story, if you found yourself moved by Robert and Margaret's beautiful love story and inspired by how one woman's final request created a legacy of compassion that continues to impact lives, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that true love endures, that service to others gives life meaning, and that even in our final days we have the power to make the world a better place. Robert would want you to know that every subscription, every share, every conversation sparked by this story extends Margaret's legacy just a little bit further, touching hearts and changing lives in ways that ripple outward, like the impact of one woman's simple but profound final wish. Margaret taught us all that the measure of a life well lived is not in what we accumulate but in what we give away, not in how long we live but in how much love we share, and not in being remembered ourselves but in creating memories and meaning that continue to bless others long after we're gone. Thank you for watching, and may we all aspire to love as deeply and give as generously as Margaret and Robert Rodriguez showed us is possible.